All right. Welcome back. We're going to take a look again at American industrialization. However, this time we're really going to look at the response to industrialization. And we'll be focusing on the progressives and kind of their poster man, I don't know, Teddy Roosevelt. All right. So first, we got to just kind of review some of the problems of industrialization. We talked a little bit about this, particularly here in California, looking at, in particular, at the impact of the railroad. However, this is going to be a little bit more broad. So some of the struggles of the farmers, they really felt powerless. So if you look at this political cartoon, you kind of have the pyramid of the capitalist system, and you have the farmers at the very bottom saying, we feed everybody, and yet they're not getting the benefits of any of industrialization, and they don't have any power in government. They don't feel like they have a voice anywhere. And so farmers feel incredibly powerless as a result of these huge businesses and corporations getting the ear of government and getting all the kind of power in government as well. The farmers also feel incredibly abused by the railroad. Again, remember this political cartoon, right? They felt like the rates were too high and they had to use the railroad to ship their food, but the rates were extremely high. Plus, remember, the railroads were getting land granted to them from the government. Farmers weren't getting land given to them or granted to them from the government. So they felt like the railroad was getting unfair treatment because they were seen as this big corporation. They were part of industrialization. In addition, farmers had significant increasing debt during this time. So you can see the red in this image here is where farmers are paying more for purchases and they receive for their products, right? So they have to pay more for the stuff they need, but they're not getting much money back. This is a huge part of this is because supply increased during industrialization with inventions, right? That not only were new inventions helping industrialization, but there were also new inventions for farmers, new technology being introduced into farming. Well, that technology, those new inventions cost money. And so farmers would take out loans to purchase these, which would lead to them producing more food, which is great. But if you have more food on the market, that means the price of that good is going to go down. So the stuff that they're selling is worth less than it had been before, and they have more bills to pay because of this technology that they'd bought. So we can see that they have significantly more debt than they'd had before. In addition, we have some really significant social problems from industrialization. We talked a little bit about the discrimination toward immigrants. I know I've shown you this political cartoon before, but I just think it's so powerful. So this idea that immigrants aren't wanted anymore in the 19-teens and eventually into that passes in the 1920s, we see immigration quotas. So kind of the limits on the number of immigrants that are welcome in. At the end of the 1800s or the end of the 19th century, we saw the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act. You can see this political cartoon on the left here. This idea was the idea of restricting immigrants and forcing them to take literacy tests that would prove whether they could read and write before they were even allowed into our country, which would mean we only allow educated people in because they would be able to read and write. So we see this discrimination toward immigrants coming in, and then once they were into our country as well. In addition, we see huge growth of cities during this time. We call this urbanization, and this leads to very, very poor living conditions. The kind of housing situation that at the time was called tenement housing. You can see the picture here says the dumbbell tenement. This was a very common style of building. They were built very quickly and not built very well. They were built pretty poorly. They weren't necessarily designed to stay up for very long, not a lot of ventilation. You can see that, so there's shared bathrooms on every floor, and then each kind of color here would represent a different living unit. So this would be one family, this is another family's apartment, this would be another family's apartment, and this would be a fourth family's apartment. And they'd all share these bathrooms, and then here's the stairwell. But again, the living conditions within these tenements, as you can see in the photograph here, were quite poor. In addition, because cities were being built so quickly and so many people were showing up, there was really not enough public services, garbage, sewage, all of that kind of stuff was just not available as quickly as people were flooding in and as quickly as these cities were being built. In addition, we've talked about this as well, but just drawing your attention one more time, child labor was a huge problem during industrialization because wages were so low for these factory workers. All family members had to work in order to make ends meet. Some of the worst working conditions existed in the mines, where children were deep, deep down in the mines, but also working in factories as well. But it wasn't just kind of social and factors of industrialization or even just the farmers. We also saw some economic problems that were caused by industrialization. And we've talked about this before, right? We saw the rise of these huge corporations. Here's a political cartoon that represents Standard Oil, which was an oil monopoly run by John D. Rockefeller. You may recognize the name J.D. Rockefeller. And you can see in this political cartoon, this particular sea monster has their tentacles wrapped around government buildings and people. These large monopolies, these large businesses would pay for the political officer, right? The people running for election, he would pay for their campaigns. And then once those people get into office, they're not going to pass laws to restrict these businesses because they paid for them to get into office. And so we had the rise of these huge monopolies and these big businesses that led to these economic problems of industrialization, which also led to these political problems. So one of the things that comes about during this time period that was very prominent everywhere was what we call a political machine. And the political machine is this political organization that's run by what they called a boss, okay? And this boss would kind of set up systems to get people elected. So immigrants would come in and need jobs, and they would be directed to the boss, and the boss would be like, okay, I'll give you a job. You can go work at that factory. However, when it's time to vote, you got to vote for my guy, right? And so then this political machine would ensure that certain people were elected into office, and in response would get some sort of power or would receive rewards from people once they were elected into office. So there was a lot of corruption in the government. Political officials were not being freely elected by the people because these political bosses and these political machines were kind of running things. Not kind of, they were running things. So all of this led to a couple of different responses. The first one I'm going to talk about here are the populists. So these are the responses to industrialization. Now, the populists were primarily those farmers that I was talking about at the very beginning who felt powerless, who were really kind of left out of decisions because they weren't financing, the political elected officials. They were just the people feeding everybody else, right? So the populists were led by farmers who felt significantly isolated and ignored. And their main goal was to restore power to the people. Okay, they believed that the farmers and the workers needed to be free from these exploitive or manipulative practices of big business. Their main target, because again, they were farmers, was the railroad. All right, their kind of platform, what they stood on, what they were fighting for was that the government would take over ownership of all the railroads, the telephone lines, and the telegraph lines. So again, thinking about the modes of communication and transportation, they believe the government should take over those things so that the people could actually afford to use them. They also fought for better working conditions. And this is one thing that's a little bit different than what a lot of people think of today, they were fighting for increased immigration restrictions. So they're fighting for the people, but also they want to keep people out. They don't want any more people coming in. They were fighting to decrease the number of immigrants. They wanted stronger restrictions against immigration. Now, the populists really didn't gain much national power. Okay. You can see, look at this map. You can pause when I'm in a second, and really kind of look at the key at the bottom to see what this map is showing you. But really it's showing you that populists were elected to local positions, and even some governments had, some states had a majority of populists at the state level, but there was very little national power that the populists had, and ultimately they kind of fizzled out. And so they kind of blend into what becomes called the progressives. The progressives had a shift. This is a shift away from the laissez-faire kind of idea of the government being hands-off of business and into the idea of government activism, right? They believed that the government should very much be active in businesses in order to regulate the power of the businesses. So away from laissez-faire, away from hands-off, and actually being involved and being active. The goals of the Populist Party were to get rid of government corruption. So instead of having these huge companies kind of being even more powerful than the government, they want to get rid of that. And they want to lessen the power of the big business. So they're not trying to get rid of business altogether, but just lessen the power of the big business. They believe that they need to protect the general welfare of the public, and that the government is actually a protector of private property and of individual freedom. That the government should be an agent for social justice, that it's not just about kind of making random laws, but the government should actually be an agent for social justice. So the progressives were primarily white, middle class, urban professionals. So again, we see the shift. The populists were the farmers, but the progressives are urban professionals. So people who live in cities, and they have professional jobs. Okay. But they felt alienated and frustrated by the growth of these huge corporations and these huge big businesses. And they were frustrated by the gap in society that you had these industrialists way up high making oodles and oodles and oodles of cash, and the laborers and the workers getting almost none of it. And so they're kind of in the middle, right? And they are frustrated by this gap. And so one of the ways that they kind of caused change is they called themselves muckrakers. Okay, rake in the muckrakers. And muckrakers attacked corporations. They attacked corrupt government practices and religious organizations that were ignoring the social problems of industrialization. They used graphic descriptions to cause attention or to call attention to problems. So one of the most famous ones is a book called The Jungle, which was written by Upton Sinclair, and it describes the meat packing industry, and it is absolutely disgusting. Also bringing attention to child labor, using photographs to bring attention to child labor, ultimately trying to shame people into action. Like, this is terrible, you need to do something about it. So that was what the muckrakers did. They went around kind of causing problems. It's pretty cool. The progressives were a lot more than that, though. They were kind of far-reaching. They had lots and lots of different programs that ultimately led to a lot of change. So the progressives, just to kind of give you some time period, really take hold in the early 1900s and continue into the 19-teens. Now, a lot of the laws that eventually get passed as a result of the progressives are later. So you can see here, one of the key programs that they had was women's suffrage. Women's suffrage is the woman's right to vote. Ultimately, women get the right to vote here in America in 1920. So these are some images from Alice Paul and her followers trying to fight for the right to vote, standing outside of the White House, asking Mr. President, how much longer do we have to wait? Inez Milholland, she is up here. It's an incredibly strong woman, was kind of seen as their champion. So another program was temperance, and ultimately leads to prohibition. So temperance is the idea of tempering or lessening the amount of alcohol being drunk. And this was primarily a movement that was run by women because they were really the ones who really suffered the most due to the abuse of alcohol. So ultimately, they ended up being successful, and prohibition was passed in 1919. So there was a constitutional amendment that prohibited the sale, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of alcohol. So you were no longer allowed to make, transport, or sell alcohol. Now, obviously, it was still done, but that's a different story for a different day. And ultimately, this amendment was repealed during the Great Depression. But again, this was examples of federal national success by the progressives. They fought for this, and ultimately a law was passed prohibiting alcohol. Another key thing that progressives fought for was public education. So free education for kids in the United States. Another idea of the progressives and ultimately getting passed because you're all listening to this now. And then another thing that the progressives fought very strongly for was housing reform. Again, trying to address those poor living conditions that were the result of that urbanization and cities growing too quickly. Now, as I mentioned, not only did they get laws passed, but also the progressives had success on the political level. And Teddy Roosevelt really comes to be seen as kind of the face of the progressive movement. Theodore Roosevelt was a president. He became president in 1901. He was actually vice president in the election of 1900, but President McKinley is assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. Now, he'd been governor of New York before this, but he was seen as a pretty progressive president. He had what he called a square deal, which we'll talk about in a minute, but he had this economic philosophy that he believed that we need to protect capitalism or protect our economy through careful government regulation. He really held the ideal that the government should be kind of the mediator of the conflicting economic forces that existed in the United States. He really believed that the government should be involved in helping between owners and laborers, in guaranteeing justice for everybody, and giving favors to nobody. Right? So this is a really very different idea than, say, those like political machines we were talking about that was all about favors. He was often referred to as what we call a trust buster. So remember the Sherman Antitrust Act that was passed at the end of the 1800s? He came into office and he began breaking up the trusts or busting the trusts, breaking up these large corporations. He really drew a distinction between bad trusts and good trusts. Teddy Roosevelt believed that a bad trust was one that kind of sought profit at the detriment of the community. So they wanted to make money that was more important to this corporation than being a good part of the community, okay, or being good to its workers or things like that. So that was a bad trust, and he would break up those corporations or those trusts. But he also believed that there were good trusts. There were good corporations, and good trusts were those who operated to benefit the community and were good for the community. Another part of his economic philosophy was expansion. Teddy Roosevelt was absolutely instrumental in the building of the Panama Canal. In fact, he went down there himself. He helped broker the deal with Panama. He helped in the Panamanian Revolution, and ultimately is responsible for the building of the Panama Canal. He was known to say that he was down in Panama and he said, you know what? I don't know if I have, it wasn't up to me whether I have the power to do this. I'm doing this, and I left Congress up there to debate whether I can do this all day long, but I'm down here building the canal. All right, so this was his economic philosophy, kind of this distinction between good and bad trusts, also expansion as well. He also had a very strong social philosophy, and this is what I mentioned, that square deal, okay, that we need to demand that businesses are fair to people, and then we'll be fair to businesses, right? So everybody's going to be fair with each other. There's going to have a square deal, a fair deal for everybody, all right? He intervened in strikes on behalf of the owners and the workers. In fact, he helped to mitigate the coal strike in Pennsylvania in 1902. He literally went back and forth between the owners and the workers and talked to them and negotiated a deal to end the strike. All right. He helped to regulate the rates of the railroad. Remember what the populists were fighting for? He didn't have government takeover. He still believed in capitalism and free enterprise, but he did regulate the rates, the cost of the railroad. He also had created more protection for consumers, you and I, right? So things like the Pure Food and Drug Act. The FDA that we have today started by Teddy Roosevelt. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 was passed directly because of reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, because it was so disgusting. And that political cartoon kind of represents that. So these are examples of laws that were passed because of the progressives and because of Teddy Roosevelt ultimately coming into office. And then Teddy Roosevelt also had a very strong environmental philosophy. Teddy Roosevelt was born in New York, but ends up spending a huge amount of time out in the West, in the Dakotas, out kind of playing cowboy, running around in the open range all the time. And he really, during this time, he loved nature, he loved animals, and he understood that we need to protect natural resources for the future generations. And so as a result, he created wildlife refuges. He created our current national park system that we still have today and monuments that exist. Okay, it's one of the reasons why his face is on Mount Rushmore with the likes of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. The picture here that you see right in the middle here, that's him with John Muir. Like John Muir, there's the John Muir Hospital named after an actual person. Yeah, the John Muir. And behind them is the Yosemite Valley. He was instrumental in creating that as a national park. He really believed that we needed to protect this land and that there's certain land that must be protected for future generations. And so all of this kind of embodies what the progressives were fighting for. And we see, again, while the populists kind of died out at the local level, progressives were able to move up to the federal level and actually create quite a bit of change in direct response to those problems from industrialization. So this brings us to the end of our lecture for today. I thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, be sure to email me or come to office hours. And I look forward to talking about this soon with you in class. Take care.